British and American conservatives were all afraid of socialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The American trade union movement never created a political party of its own, but the British union movement did, founding the Labour Party in 1900, which declared its explicit allegiance to socialism in 1917. The Liberal Party in the early 20th century, afraid of Labour competition, tried to hold on to its voters' loyalty by passing social welfare legislation. The Conservatives, whose landed estates would be taxed to pay for it, indignantly opposed the legislation, which was nicknamed the People's Budget. When the Conservative-dominated House of Lords refused to pass the Budget Act, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith threatened to pack it with pro-budget sympathisers, just as Lord Grey had threatened in 1832. Once again, the Lords backed down and were forced to accept a permanent reduction in their constitutional powers by the Parliament Act of 1911. Terrified by the rise of socialism, the Conservatives were at the same time dismayed by the possibility of Irish Home Rule. They tiptoed to the brink of treason in trying to prevent it, and renamed themselves the Unionist Party as an expression of their belief that the union of England and Ireland was vital. Well, a hostile political and legal environment prompted the growth of trade unions and labour politics in late 19th century and early 20th century Britain. And as I said at the beginning of the course, because conservatism is very often reactive, it's necessary for us to understand the logic of the development of the labour movement in order then to understand the logic of the conservative reaction to it. Britain's rising industrial working class over the course of the 19th century began to organise in trade unions, and it became a little bit easier to do so in the second half of the century, especially once Disraeli's legislation decriminalised or took away from employers the option of regarding unionists as criminal conspirators. There's a very conspicuous lack of social class mobility in British history. People have been born for centuries into a social class with the assumption that that's where they'll stay. There's really no equivalent in British history of what's called the American dream, the idea of individual advancement through the social ranks. And that, in turn, the idea that one's class position is something permanent, makes labour solidarity more likely in Britain than it was in the United States, where already by the late 19th century the ideology of social mobility was well established. Britain was also ethnically very homogeneous. And again, this is in striking contrast to the situation in the United States, where employers would often deliberately play off different ethnic groups within the workforce. In other words, a big employer like Andrew Carnegie would hire some British workers, immigrant workers, some Slavs, some Italians, some Poles, some Jews. So it was difficult even for them to talk to one another, and very unlikely that they'd all instantly recognise that they had common interests as working men. In Britain, there was no such ethnic diversity, and therefore solidarity came easier. Britain also enjoyed or experienced a very, very high degree of geographical stability. That is, nearly everybody stayed in the place where they were born, so that in one particular place the same families lived together and were interrelated and had been over many generations. That also tended to strengthen their unity when they came to form a trade union, especially when they were not only interrelated, but very often linked in organisations like the Methodist Church. So union growth took place more quickly in Britain. Some union leaders began to study politics, economics, the work of Engels and Marx, and to see the possibilities in direct political action. The very first working men to get into Parliament were so-called Lib Labs. That is, they believed in Labour principles, but they entered Parliament in collaboration with the Liberal Party. But of course, for a factory worker or a coal miner to go into Parliament, in which everyone's dressed in morning dress and top hats, it was very easy to be socially intimidated and to be so impressed by one's own success in having gone to Parliament that it tended to have a slightly de-radicalising effect. The first independent Labour candidate elected to Parliament was Keir Hardie, a miner from Scotland, who took his seat in 1892. Keir Hardie defied parliamentary convention by refusing to wear a frock coat or a high collar. or a top hat. He appeared instead in a tweed suit with a cloth cap and a socialist red tie, in a wagon pulled by a horse. In other words, in the most conspicuous possible way, he flouted parliamentary conventions as a way of saying, I'm a working man who's coming into Parliament, and I'm not going to play according to the old rules of the upper classes. Keir Hardie, a spellbinding speaker, advocated a graduated income tax, universal free education, votes for women, and the abolition of the House of Lords, several of which have since come to pass, though not all. Now, the organisation which gathered together Britain's diverse trade unions was the TUC, the Trades Unions Congress, and it decided in 1900 that it was going to create its own political party. At first it was called the Labour Representation Committee, and it was created partly at the urging of Keir Hardie. But then an important legal decision made the necessity and the relevance of the Labour Party more pressing than ever. This was the Taff Vale case of 1901. What happened is that a group of South Wales railroad workers went on strike. The company sued the union for damages, in other words, money the company hadn't made while the men were on strike, and won. And the decision was upheld in the highest court of the land, the House of Lords, which is the British equivalent of the Supreme Court. Now, the decision in the Taff Vale case would effectively have made strikes impossible, because every union would be ruined by having to pay damages to the employer. That intensified the decision of the TUC, the Trades Unions Congress, to politicise, to get directly involved in politics so that it could contribute to shaping legislation. And of course, the early Labour leaders said, the majority of people in this country are labouring men. If we organise adequately, we'll be able to dominate British politics. Now, at the same time, the American counterpart of the TUC, the AFL, the American Federation of Labour, which ironically was also under the leadership of an English immigrant, Samuel Gompers, an English Jew in the cigar trades who'd moved to America, the AFL decided not to create a political party. And this is a fateful division in the roads of the two countries' histories. The British did create a Labour Party, the Americans didn't. Eugene Debs, an American railroad worker, did create the American Socialist Party at about the same time, but it never became a mass party able to replace one of the other two, whereas Labour, with the backing of the TUC, did become a new mass party. It won 29 seats in the election of 1906, in alliance but separate from the Liberals. Many of the Labour MPs, members of Parliament, were openly socialist, denouncing capitalism, denouncing private property, denouncing hereditary peerage and the monarchy. Now, over against the rise of the Labour Party, that had the effect of strengthening conservative bonds between the landowners and the businessmen. At the beginning of the 19th century, they'd been at odds with each other. The businessmen had been the radicals in those days, but by the early 20th century, the landowners and the businessmen recognised a common threat from Labour. Victorian-era disputes between landed commercial and industrial wealth were now offset by the common threat of Labour and the possibility of socialism. So the Conservative Party now managed to unify all these propertied groups. The long-term loser of this reconfiguration was to be the Liberal Party, whereas the Conservatives found a way to thrive right into our own time. It was in the very early 20th century, just as Labour was beginning to be a factor on the British political landscape, that the leadership of the Conservative Party passed from Lord Salisbury, Robert Cecil, Lord Salisbury, to Arthur Balfour. Now, Arthur Balfour, the Conservative leader, regarded the Conservatives as the party that was destined to govern. Even after a very severe electoral defeat in the year 1906, Balfour at once saw an opportunity to thwart the Liberals, who were the winner of this election. He said, whether in power or whether in opposition, the great Unionist party, the Conservative Party, should still control the destinies of this great empire. Why? Well, because there was a big Conservative majority in the House of Lords, which meant that whenever legislation came up from the Liberal government, it would pass through the Commons but then be rejected by the House of Lords. Balfour himself had inherited the party from his uncle, Lord Salisbury, who'd been Prime Minister after Disraeli from 1886 to 92, and again from 1895 to 1902. I mentioned previously that his name was Robert Cecil, And the fact that he was able to pass the government on to his nephew gave rise to the saying, "Bob's your uncle." In other words, it was because his uncle was the old Prime Minister that he could become the new Conservative Party leader. And it's a phrase which has entered English now to mean, here's how a little problem can be sorted out. At first, Balfour had seemed like a lightweight, but gradually his full political capacity became clear. Listen to a beautiful comment by Winston Churchill on Balfour, which could almost be taken as a general definition of what the ideal Conservative leader is supposed to be like. This is what Churchill wrote about Balfour in a wonderful book called Great Contemporaries. His aversion from the Roman Catholic faith was dour and inveterate. Otherwise, he seemed to have the personal qualifications of a great pope. He had that composed, detached, uplifted mental and moral vision, combined with the art of dexterous and practical management, requisite for those who guide the course of permanent societies. To the defence of his principles and prejudices, he summoned every resource of conduct, oratory and dialectic. But he knew when to change, and not only when to change, but how to change, in accordance with the pressures of events. In mind, he was always young, and yet he inspired the feeling that he possessed the wisdom of the ages. I think that's a beautiful passage by Churchill, describing Balfour as the ideal Conservative leader. Balfour was independently wealthy, a lifelong bachelor, and a very serious philosopher, a writer on philosophical questions, another of these odd characters to become the Conservative leader. Churchill adds that he was good at conversation with everyone he met and put everyone at their ease, but goes on to say, yet he was swift to mark by some judicious and upsetting question any departure from truth, sense or taste as he conceived them. He would very soon have put Socrates in his place if that old fellow had played any of his dialectical tricks on him. When I go to heaven, I shall try to arrange a chat between these two on some topic not too recondite for me to follow. That's a perfect little bit of Churchilliana, imagining a conversation between Balfour, whom he knew well, and Socrates. Well, Churchill himself enters the political picture at this point. He was to be one of Balfour's most distinguished successors, and he began his career in Parliament in the year 1900. Churchill entered Parliament as a Conservative, but in 1904 he did what was called crossing the floor. That is, leaving the party and moving over to join the opposition. He crossed the floor in 1904 because he favoured free trade and he disliked a Conservative proposal to introduce tariffs. Churchill was regarded as a traitor by many Conservatives, most of whom ostentatiously walked out of the House of Commons chamber while Churchill was making a speech against tariffs. And Churchill was, so to speak, a hereditary Conservative. He was very, very highly connected, related closely to the Dukes of Marlborough. His father was Lord Randolph Churchill, who'd also been a senior Conservative politician who'd risen to a brilliant career early in his life in the House of Commons. Winston, the son, his mother was an American beauty, Jenny Jerome. Winston's own early life, as soon as he left school, he went to Sandhurst for the training of army officer cadets, then went off to India, participated in a war on the northwest front of India, then in Egypt, then in Sudan, and then in the Boer War in South Africa at the turn of the century. He made it a daring escape from a Boer prisoner of war camp and was already famous in his own right by the time he became a Member of Parliament at the age of 26 in 1900. Well, Churchill was dismayed by the ostentatious plutocrats of Edwardian England. And he was opposed to tariffs because they politicised the economy. He had the same kind of objection to them that William Graham Sumner, the American economist, had, whom I mentioned in an earlier lecture. By 1950, Winston Churchill was going to be the personification of British conservatism. So it's odd to see him here in 1904 joining the other side, and within a year or two playing a leading role in it. From 1904 right through to 1925, Winston Churchill was a Liberal and played an important role in several Liberal governments. Well, after their great victory in 1906, the Liberal Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, presented the People's Budget in 1909. And this was a much more far-reaching social welfare budget than had ever previously been seen in British political life. Introduced partly as a way for the Liberals to mollify the Labour MPs whose support they now needed. It was openly redistributive in intention, taxing the wealthy to support the beginnings of a welfare state. And it was much more extensive and much more costly than Disraeli's concessions had been to the lower classes. David Lloyd George, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was a Welshman, alert to the possibilities of class provocation, and he took a gleeful pleasure in goading the Lords. He knew, or he foresaw, that the Lords would refuse to pass the budget, and that then he and Asquith, the Prime Minister, would have the chance to curtail or abolish the power of the Lords. Lloyd George was no respecter of their rank. He said they were, quote, descended partly from plunderers who came over with William the Conqueror, and partly from plunderers of the poor at the Reformation. An aristocracy is like cheese. The older it is, the higher it becomes. Should 500 men, ordinary men, chosen accidentally from among the unemployed, override the judgment, the deliberate judgment of millions of people who are engaged in the industry which makes the wealth of this country? Well, that phrase for the Lords, the unemployed, was a brilliant stroke of provocation on Lloyd George's part. It enraged the Lords, who hated to even contemplate the possibility that they could be thought of as unemployed people. Churchill was a great friend of Lloyd George in these days. Churchill became the president of the Board of Trade and then Home Secretary. And so he was, in fact, there, present at the creation of the beginnings of Britain's welfare state. Well, as Lloyd George had predicted, the House of Lords rejected the budget. And in doing so, they violated a 300-year-old tradition against the Lords asserting themselves on money bills. The tradition was that the Lords were free to intervene in any kind of legislation except those dealing explicitly with budget questions. So by doing so, they were violating tradition. Asquith, the Prime Minister, called 2 general elections on the question in the year 1910. And in both of these elections, he won Liberal majorities, but not overall majorities. That is, he was dependent on the help of the Labour MPs and the help of the Irish Nationalist MPs. Labour's representation increased again, further evidence that Labour was to be one of the coming forces of 20th century politics, while the Irish Nationalists held the swing votes, which would lead to either success or failure for the Liberal government. Not surprisingly, the Irish Nationalists' quid pro quo for helping Asquith was a bill for Irish Home Rule. But the Conservatives were implacably opposed to Irish Home Rule, and they knew that if they yielded on the House of Lords question and the budget, they'd then be forced to accept Irish Home Rule as well. The Conservatives felt so strongly about Ireland remaining part of the United Kingdom that they'd renamed themselves the Unionist Party. From the late 1890s right through into the 1920s, the Conservative Party was more often known as the Unionist Party or the Conservative and Unionist Party. Well, the Parliament Act of 1911 sharply curtailed the power of the Lords, reducing their role to that of giving a 2-year veto on any legislation passed up by the Commons. If they'd refused to cooperate, Asquith, the Prime Minister, had ordered a new king, George V, to create new peers, new lords, who were in favour of the reform. That is, repeating the threat which Lord Grey had made back in 1832 as a way of getting passage of the first Reform Act. It was a bitter demonstration to the new king of his powerlessness. Listen to the historian George Dangerfield describing what happened. Peerages were often bestowed upon the wrong men for the wrong reasons, but they were nonetheless rewards. They were honours. Suddenly to ennoble some 500 obscure and undeserving men simply as a political measure was to turn the House of Lords into a vulgar joke. It was to make a joke of the royal prerogative. It was a melancholy and maddening step for any sovereign to take who was at all serious about his dignity. Well, what about the Lords themselves? How did they react to the knowledge that they were in danger of being swamped? The Conservative Lords split between what were called the hedgers and the ditchers. The hedgers said that they must compromise or face being swamped or even abolished. The ditchers said, never, whatever the outcome, we won't compromise our principles. We'll fight in the last ditch, hence their name, the ditchers. Here's the historian George Dangerfield again. This venerable House of Lords was not simply a constitutional relic of the great landed fortunes. It was also a fetish. It meant the ideally paternal responsibility of the noble few. And though this meaning was quite irrelevant to the 20th century, yet those who tried to preserve it were not merely idle men or arrogant men. They saw the passing of certain values, which at their best were very high, and at their worst were very human. They did not realise that life consists in change, that nothing can stand still, that today's shrines are only fit for tomorrow's cattle. Clinging to the realities of the past, they prepared to defend their dead cause to the finish. Well, you can tell from that passage that Dangerfield himself is no conservative. He regards the Lords as outdated, but he admits that the members of the Lords did represent the protection of certain cherished values, particularly the idea of long continuity across the centuries. Politics was becoming a rough game in England by this point, by 1911. Some Tories in the Commons shouted traitor at the Prime Minister Asquith when he tried to speak. It was the first time ever in the history of Parliament that the Prime Minister had been shouted down in the House of Commons and denied the chance to speak. That's how infuriated some of the Conservatives were. Well, in the end, in the House of Lords, the Hedgers won a marginal majority and grudgingly accepted the Parliament Act. The ditchers were furious and called Tories who'd voted for the Act Judases and traitors. But of course the result was that the actual Conservative majority in the House of Lords remained untouched. From that time on they had no more than a 2-year veto on legislation. But because of the timing of events over the next few years, that itself was going to prove to be very, very politically significant. The social composition of the Lords remained undiluted, which was the whole point of the Hedgers' position. It remained predominantly Conservative. And it wasn't until the very end of the 20th century that there was a major democratic reform of the House of Lords, finally diminishing its hereditary principle. Well, intermixed with the tensions over the People's Budget and the Parliament Act was the question of Home Rule for Ireland. This was another galvanising issue for Conservatives in 1910 and 1911, and it had given great intensity, added intensity, to the debate over the Parliament Bill. A bit of history is again necessary. Gladstone, the great Liberal Prime Minister of the 1880s, had proposed Irish Home Rule in Parliament as far back as 1886. But in doing so, he'd fragmented the Liberal Party by prompting key members of his party to leave altogether and to go over to the Conservative side. Gladstone had seen the wisdom of Home Rule, since the overwhelming majority of Irishmen were in favour of it, and hated being dominated by an alien Protestant English minority. But Irish Union was an issue that generated intense passion for English Conservatives. For many Liberals too, some of whom, like Joseph Chamberlain, the former Lord Mayor of Birmingham, who'd now become a Liberal parliamentarian, Chamberlain and many others felt so strongly that they quit Gladstone's government and went over to the Conservative side. Gladstone's bill failed in the Commons. Gladstone resigned and he lost the ensuing election very badly. Lord Randolph Churchill, the father of Winston, had exhorted Irish Protestants, the Protestant minority in Ireland, to resist Home Rule at all costs. Now, ever since the 17th century, since the days of King James I and the days of Oliver Cromwell, Protestant settlements had taken place in Ireland, particularly in the 6 northern counties, the area that's called Ulster. And that had given the Protestants a local majority in Ulster. It was by 1900, it was the most industrialised part of Ireland. The big city was Belfast, and it's in the Belfast shipyards that great ships like the Titanic were built. It was also the wealthiest part of Ireland because it was industrial, and it was passionately pro-union. So even within Ireland, there's a very, very striking split between the Home Rule preference of the majority, the southern counties, and the anti-Home Rule unionism of the north. Irish nationalist members of Parliament would only cooperate with Asquith's Liberal government in 1910 and 1911 in return for the promise of a new Home Rule bill. Between 1910 and 1913, Irish radicals, dissatisfied by the rate of progress in Parliament, were beginning to gather weapons and to arm, pushing the Home Rule Party leader, John Redmond, to make more strident demands for immediate liberation of Ireland. At the same time, English Conservatives and Irish Protestants were arming and drilling too, getting ready for the possibility of open fighting, the possibility of an Irish civil war. A new Conservative leader who displaced Balfour was Andrew Bonar Law, replacing Balfour after the Parliament crisis, and he himself was a Protestant Ulsterman. He was born in Canada from an Ulster Protestant family, but then grew up in Glasgow. A teetotaler, a Puritan, another very unusual man to become Tory leader, as surprising in his way as Disraeli had been. Bonar Law was hard-nosed, utterly unromantic, and completely remote, again, from the landed gentlemen and aristocrats who were central to the Conservative Party. Another very powerful Conservative at the same time was Sir Edward Carson, a successful barrister, the man who'd prosecuted Oscar Wilde in one of the most famous cases. He was a Dublin Protestant Member of Parliament who became a spokesman for the Ulster Unionists, that is, the Protestants of Ireland who don't want Home Rule. And he threatened Asquith that Ulster would go to war against Home Rule if the government pushed it through Parliament. In 1912, at a massive rally in Belfast, Carson told a huge crowd of Protestant demonstrators, "Raise your hands. Repeat after me. Never, under any circumstances, will we submit to Home Rule." And then a vast Union Jack was unfurled, 48 feet by 25 feet in size, supposedly the biggest Union Jack ever created. A totem, a way of saying to the British politicians, we the Conservatives and we the Ulster Unionists will never compromise on this point, that we belong to Great Britain, to the United Kingdom. It's an incredible situation that senior Conservative members of Parliament should be threatening civil war in the face of government legislation. And this truly was one of those moments in history when it did seem as though the long, long tradition of political stability was going to be overturned, possibly even by senior members of one of the two great parties, the Conservatives. Well, in its draft legislation for Irish Home Rule, Asquith's government showed signs of bowing to unionist intimidation by raising the possibility of separating Ulster from the rest of Ireland, that is, partition. That was dismaying to the Home Rule Party, who insisted on an all-or-nothing position. Redmond, the leader of the Home Rule parliamentarians, was being pushed very hard by Irish radicals who were threatening to take it to a contest of arms. Well, as the crisis intensified, suddenly in 1914, really very unexpectedly, the First World War began, and that forced a postponement of the resolution of the Irish question. It also bore witness to a Conservative revival. But here's the irony of the situation. Legislation in favour of Irish Home Rule had passed through Parliament in 1912, but was rejected by the House of Lords. Passed through Parliament again in 1913, but was again rejected. And then passed through the Commons for the third time in 1914, and the two vetoes had now been used up, the two vetoes to which the Lords were limited by the new Parliament Bill. The Lords would have been unable to stop it again. But then implementation was postponed because of the outbreak of the war, and everybody agreed, we've got to shelve this question, or nearly everybody agreed, we've got to shelve this question until the war can be won. The political beneficiaries within Britain of the First World War were certainly the Conservatives. Here's the historian Robert Blake. He says, on almost every issue that came up, Conservative tradition and ideology was better suited than Liberal to meet the needs of the hour. Conscription, the defence of the realm, Ireland, indeed all the necessities of a prolonged war, tended to create doubts and divisions in the Liberals. After all, they were the party of liberty, and liberty is the first casualty of war. They were the party of moral conscience, and that is another casualty of war. They were the party of legalism, parliamentary forms, constitutional propriety, and these are also casualties of war. Well, that's a very shrewd remark by Robert Blake, that the Conservatives were better able to capitalise on this new emergency situation. In a subsequent lecture, I'm going to talk about what happened in the British politics of the First World War itself and the way in which unresolved questions like Ireland were resolved partly in the crucible of the war and partly in the years immediately afterwards. But before I do so, I'd like to address one more issue of vital concern relating to both British and American conservatives in the years before World War I, and that is the question of the special destiny of the Anglo-Saxons.